A lot of things people call American today actually began in Africa. From music and food to hairstyles, stories, and even everyday slang, African culture shaped the U.S. in ways most people never talk about. These ideas crossed the ocean, survived hardship, and quietly became part of American life. In this video, we're counting down 10 things the U.S. copied from Africa, traditions that started on the mother continent but became mainstream in America. Let's dive in. At number 10, hairstyles and grooming. Before America turned braids, cornrows, and locks into trends, they were already centuries-old African traditions. In many African communities, hair is not just style, it's identity. Braiding patterns could show your tribe, your age, your status, even your spiritual beliefs. When Africans were enslaved and taken to the Americas, they carried this hair culture with them, even when everything else was stripped away. In the plantations, cornrows became more than beauty. In some stories, they were used to hide seeds and even as secret maps for escape routes. Fast forward to the US today, and you see the same styles on athletes, rappers, actors, and everyday people. Braided wigs, feed-in braids, locks, twist-outs, afros. The natural hair movement, edge control, shea butter, scalp oils, protective styles, all of that is Africa echoing loudly in American bathrooms and barbershops. What the U.S. calls protective style or LOC journey, Africa has called a crown for generations. At number 9, herbal medicine. Long before pharmacies and hospitals became mainstream in America, African herbal knowledge was already shaping early medical practices in the South. Enslaved Africans arrived with generations of botanical wisdom, remedies for fever, stomach issues, infections, injuries, and spiritual cleansing. They understood the power of roots, leaves, barks, and seeds in ways European settlers simply didn't. Herbs like ginger, kola nut, aloe vera, hibiscus, mint, moringa, bitter leaf, castor oil, and shea butter were introduced or popularized in the U.S. because Africans used them daily. Enslaved healers, men and women, became unofficial doctors on plantations, treating not only their fellow enslaved people, but sometimes white families as well. Their remedies were copied, repackaged, and absorbed into American folk medicine. Even today, the herbal teas, detox mixes, skin butters, and natural ointments Americans love have African fingerprints all over them. Root work, hoodoo, and southern herbal healing traditions all trace back to the same source. African medicine didn't just survive in America. It became the foundation of many natural health practices people celebrate today. At number 8, social activism. The roots of American protest culture, from civil rights marches to modern movements, can be traced straight back to African traditions of communal resistance. In many African societies, people survived hardship by organizing together, protecting one another, and using community councils to challenge injustice. When Africans were enslaved in the U.S., that spirit didn't disappear. It adapted. Enslaved Africans formed secret networks, spiritual gatherings, coded communication systems, and leadership circles, all modeled after African resistance strategies. These early forms of organizing eventually shaped the foundation of Black activism in America. Pan-African thinkers like Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and Kwame Ture connected African struggles with American ones, inspiring movements built on unity, identity, and pride. Symbols like the raised fist, the red, black, green flag, community safety patrols, and mutual aid programs all carry African DNA. Modern movements, from civil rights to Black Lives Matter, use principles found in African liberation culture: collective decision-making, honoring ancestors, cultural symbolism, and community-centered leadership. America's most powerful activism didn't start in Washington. It started with Africa's traditions of standing together, speaking boldly, and refusing to break. At number 7, language and vernacular. One of the most powerful African influences in the United States isn't found in music or fashion. It's in the way millions of Americans speak every day. African American Vernacular English, AAVE, one of the most recognizable dialects in the U.S., is rooted directly in African linguistic patterns. The rhythm, tone, grammar, and flow mirror speech styles found across West and Central Africa. Words like finna, y'all, Nah, fo real, on God, and you feel me didn't appear out of thin air. They evolved from African languages adapting to English under brutal conditions. Even call and response speech, common in churches, classrooms, music, and social gatherings, comes from African communication traditions, where the community participates in the conversation. Over generations, AAVE influenced pop culture, comedy, movies, hip-hop, R&B, TikTok slang, and even mainstream English. Many terms Americans use today started in African communities before spreading globally. So when people say period, lit, and drip, or vibe, they're speaking echoes of Africa without even realizing it. African linguistic creativity didn't just survive in America, it reshaped the way a whole nation talks. At number 6, dance styles. If you study American dance closely, from the streets to the clubs to the big stages, you will always find Africa moving underneath the surface. African dance is built on rhythm, storytelling, and full body expression. And those elements traveled with enslaved Africans into the Americas. Over time, they mixed with new cultures and evolved into some of the most iconic U.S. dance styles: hip-hop, African footwork, and African-style body isolation. Stepping, born from South African gumboot dance. Twerking, directly connected to dances like Mapuka from Côte d'Ivoire. Breakdancing, African battle dance energy mixed with Caribbean influence. Even tap dancing traces back to African rhythmic stomping paired with Irish clogging. In the African movement, the beat drives the body, and that same heartbeat defines American street dances today. Watch any viral TikTok challenge, any halftime show, any music video. You'll see African hips, shoulders, rhythm, and grounding techniques everywhere. African dance didn't just influence U.S. culture, it became the blueprint for almost every modern American dance movement. At number 5, soul food techniques. What Americans call soul food today is actually a deeply African cooking tradition that crossed the Atlantic and adapted to a harsh new world. Enslaved Africans brought with them their culinary skills, slow cooking, frying, smoking meats, using herbs for depth, and turning simple ingredients into rich, flavorful meals. When plantation owners kept the best cuts of meat for themselves, Africans transformed the leftovers, pig feet, oxtail, chicken gizzards, into dishes that eventually became national favorites: okra, black-eyed peas, rice dishes, stews, greens, cornbread. These all trace back to West and Central African cooking. Even the technique of seasoning in layers, adding spices at different stages, is completely African. And the cast iron pot, the slow simmer, the heavy seasoning, straight from the motherland. What started as survival food became a symbol of comfort, family, and community across America. From Thanksgiving tables to Sunday dinners, so many American kitchens owe their flavor to African hands, African creativity, and African resilience. At number 4, the banjo. It may look like a classic American folk instrument, but the banjo's heartbeat is entirely African. Long before it appeared on southern porches or in country music halls, Africans were playing instruments like the akonting, ngoni, and zalam, stringed gourds with long necks that sound almost identical to the early banjo. When Africans were enslaved and brought to the Caribbean and the American South, they recreated these instruments from memory, using gourds, wood, and animal skin. By the 1700s, the banjo was the soundtrack of enslaved communities. Its sound carried across plantations during dances, storytelling nights, and celebrations. Eventually, white musicians noticed and copied it, leading to the banjo being absorbed into minstrel shows and later into bluegrass and country music. But its African origin was rarely acknowledged. Today, modern banjo historians and musicians openly trace the instrument back to West Africa. Even the playing style, plucking, finger patterns, and rhythmic strumming mirrors African techniques. So when people hear American banjo music, they're actually hearing a sound that began thousands of miles away, crafted by African hands and African memory. At number 3, jazz and blues rhythms inspired by African music. Two of America's greatest musical gifts to the world, jazz and blues, were built on African foundations. The polyrhythms, swing patterns, call and response vocals, and emotional storytelling all came directly from West and Central African traditions. plantations, Africans mixed their native rhythms with spiritual hymns and work songs, creating early blues melodies. Those field hollers, shouts, and chants later evolved into the musical language that shaped America's sound. When jazz was born in New Orleans, its improvisation style reflected African jamming culture, where musicians play off each other, responding in real time. Even the blues scale resembles African tonal systems. Of Creole tunes Without African rhythm, there would be no gospel choirs, no jazz clubs, no blues legends, no rock and roll revolution. Every saxophone solo, every blues guitar bend, every gospel choir harmony carries Africa inside it. The U.S. didn't just borrow African music became the soul of American sound. At number 2, folk tales that evolved from African stories. Some of America's most iconic folk tales, especially in the South, didn't begin in the U.S. They were carried across the ocean in the memories of enslaved Africans. Stories like Brer Rabbit came straight from African trickster tales, especially those of Anansi the Spider from Ghana and the wider Akan world. These stories were never just entertainment. They were survival tools. In African villages, trickster characters used wit to defeat stronger enemies, a message that resonated deeply among enslaved communities. As these tales traveled through generations, they adapted to American landscapes, but kept their African storytelling structure: humor, metaphors, rhythm, moral lessons, and interactive delivery. Even Black church preaching styles, spoken word poetry, and parts of hip-hop culture reflect the same oral tradition. The U.S. didn't invent the trickster hero, Africa did, and those tales still shape American storytelling today, from children's books to Hollywood screenplays. At number 1, fashion trends from African styles. At the top of the list is one of Africa's most visible influences on the U.S. fashion. From bold patterns to protective hairstyles, African style has shaped American culture for decades. Ankara prints, kente cloth, dashikis, cowrie accessories, beadwork, waist beads, head wraps. These aren't just trends. They're centuries-old African statements of identity, power, and heritage. In the U.S., African designs exploded into mainstream culture through music videos, red carpets, Afrobeat concerts, black festivals, and natural hair movements. Designers borrow African silhouettes, bead patterns, and bright color combinations for streetwear, luxury fashion, and even high-end runway shows. Waist beads were once African rites of passage. Now they're wellness accessories. Head wraps, once worn for cultural or spiritual reasons, are now everyday American fashion pieces. From Beyoncé to everyday college students, Africa's influence dominates wardrobes across the U.S. The irony? What America calls bold, exotic, or trendy, Africa simply calls tradition.